Okay, in that case, hello everyone. This is going to be a short presentation on the French Revolution, focusing on the ideas of ending where it started. Question mark? We'll see. Okay, so the overview of this presentation is going to be about continuity and change. This is obviously history of revolutions. We're talking about France. This can be unit 3 or 4. It's flexible. And the area of study is 2, which is the consequences of the French Revolution. Learning intention for today is be able to view post-revolutionary France as a set of changes and continuities, cause and effect, and apply this to historical questions. But first off, let's think about why this is particularly relevant. Well, revolutions do often tend to end where they began. We do like to think of revolutions as some great upheaval that turns society on its head, but oftentimes it doesn't end up this way from a certain point of view. A good example is the French Revolution itself, which we don't cover to its entirety, but France, while starting with King Louis XVI, an absolute monarch, actually does end up concluding the revolution with Napoleon, who also ends up to being an absolute monarch. Of course, there are a few differences between how Napoleon is a monarch as opposed to Louis, but in the simplest vein, the revolution did kind of end up as a revolution, ending up where it started, starting with an authoritarian government and ending with an authoritarian government, with, of course, the Feuillants, the Girondins, Jacobins, and Thermidorians along the way. So continuity and change. Almost any historical event can be viewed through the lens of cause and effect, aka A cause B. So we need to focus on the effect of an event. Who was affected? How were they affected? Who were winners, so-called, or losers of a particular event? Continuity obviously means something, whether it be power distribution or rights, that are given to the same people after a period of time, even if it changes name or title in some kind of way. So let's start off with some stakeholders to consider. We obviously have the classic, the bourgeoisie, the sans-culottes, the nobility, the clergy, women, and the peasants. In this diagram, we can see, or in this picture, we can see the 3 estates here. This is actually not going to be completely relevant to what we're doing, because this is more about the pre-revolution as opposed to this presentation, which is about the post-revolution, but the idea is still the same. There are still these stratified classes that all have different rights and different powers. Here we can see in the 1793 Constitution, as an example of change, it says all men are equal in nature and before the law. But take it 2 years later, and the 1795 Constitution is far less obvious about this, saying that equality is a circumstance in which the law is the same for all, whether it protects or punishes. It does not guarantee equality in nature. And so there is some change in the fact that the sans-culottes didn't take significant action in the constitutional monarchy, but as the war started looking bleak, reacted to establish the Radical Republic and also contributing to the Terror. But we'll elaborate on this in a moment. So, the revolution can be vaguely broken up into 4 parts, of which 3 are part of the study design. The constitutional monarchy, that reigned between 1791 to 92, the Radical Republic from 1792 to 94, and the Conservative Republic, which is 1794 onwards, which we don't cover to its entirety, only the beginning of it. So here I just have a few events that were particularly important in terms of analysing continuity and change. For the constitutional monarchy, the constitution is of course important, as well as the biens nationaux, or the nationalisation of church property, and the civil constitution of the clergy, which had a massive impact on the early legislative assembly. Then we have the Radical Republic, which was largely shaped by war of the First Coalition in particular, from April 1792. And of course, there would also be tension within France, the Terror. So the Social Terror, the Vendée, the Federalists, and various other counter-revolutionary movements. Then we have the Conservative Republic, which is a bit of a minor point in the study design, but still is important to touch on, which was 1794 onwards, and was largely characterized by the Thermidorian reaction and the 1795 Constitution. So here we have some statements by Sharma, who said that the revolutionary elite from all orders were the winners of the revolution. This was near the start of post-revolutionary France, with the 1791 constitution, which vastly favoured the rich. But then we have, by Hampson, that the nobility, the end of the Ancien regime for them was in August 10th, 1792. In the image, we can see that the revolution is roughly split up into 4 phases: the National Assembly, the Legislative Assembly, the Convention, and the Directory, of which the National Assembly and Legislative Assembly have kind of lumped into the constitutional monarchy, the Convention being the Radical Republic, and the Directory being the Conservative Republic. Another comparison point here is this statement by Duport, who said that the revolution is over and we must reduce liberty and settle opinion, but at the same time there's this change. Robespierre states that to safeguard freedom is to wage war on our enemies at home. So first, let's take a look at the constitutional monarchy versus the pre-1789, I should say, absolute monarchy. So the 1791 constitution empowered the bourgeois and the nobility because the voting rights were based on wealth, and there was the seizure and purchasing of church property in the Biens Nationaux, which gave the nobility and bourgeois a lot more land to work with, and also weakened the king, who was only allowed the ability of a suspensive veto to delay laws, not to prevent them. In this way, if we look at the clergy as our stakeholder, they were largely stripped of their power and property in the Biens Nationaux and were forced to become subservient to the state in the clerical oath and the civil constitution of the clergy, although many would resist this. The peasants and the workers in particular were given very little power under this new constitution, as your voting power was based largely on wealth, which of course the peasants and workers lacked to a large degree. And women, of course, as was typical in this part of history, had almost no voting power. And for context here, there was a turbulent economic situation, but peace, which is why this nationalization of church property occurred, to settle France's financial debts that had been inherited by the absolute monarchy. Here we have a quote by Coban, who says that the clerical reforms added religious schism to other causes of political and social unrest. This is a change from the absolute monarchy, where the church was very popular and very respected in its position, and thus very stable. And we can see the effect of this is that after Louis's execution, combined with the clerical reforms, this led to counter-revolution in the Vendée in 1793. So religious change had a serious effect in causing counter-revolution in France. And in this image, we can see Louis XVI's execution. Then we can move on to the Radical Republic versus the constitutional monarchy. So there's a significant way we can analyze Robespierre's role in this, in that he says that the revolution is finished in 1789, as well as this other quote that all men are free and equal in rights in the 1791 constitution. But of course we know that by 1794, Robespierre was definitely not talking about the revolution being over. He was more closer to Danton's quote that terror was to be the order of the day, passing things like the law of suspects in September 93 and the law of 22 Prairial in June 1794. This was largely based on hunting down internal enemies. This was not talking about liberty as had been stated in 1791. This is a significant change. The Radical Republic was to destroy the internal enemy through violence and murder. They were not standing up for the freedom and liberty of the 1791 Constitution or the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen as before the Constitution. The nobility, particularly the émigré, and clergy were branded enemies of the state, and the king was executed. There was, however, a good change in terms of universal male suffrage. All men had equal voting power. This gave lots of power to the sans-culottes. Civil liberties were, however, universally clamped down upon in the Terror, which began in October 1792. So how much this universal suffrage actually benefited anyone is up to a question. The peasants and the bourgeois that were from the Vendée or the Federalists, however, were drastically disempowered and, as of course, would be branded counter-revolutionaries, often open to seizure of their property and murder. So clearly, the Radical Republic was not particularly beneficial for them. This is an important distinction because while the sans-culottes in the cities benefited a lot from this Radical Republic era, the peasants, who were largely religious and thus enemies to the revolution, were very much not given an advantage in this situation. Women, it should be noted, did gain some political clout as part of the sans-culottes. They could raise arms just as any man could, and thus somewhat influence government policy in the direct democracy, as they too could contribute to the violence. For context here, it's important to realise that France is terribly losing the war at this point. They're surrounded on all sides by enemies within, the counter-revolutionaries, the Federalists and the Vendée, and without, they're fighting a war against practically every major power in Europe. And this is a desperate situation, which is why radicalism was implemented to begin with. And this is a significant change. It should be noted that this change had only occurred because of the desperate situation in France leading to the sans-culottes raising arms against the government. But then, of course, we have the conservative republic era, which is as opposed to the radical republic. And this is where a lot of the continuity occurs, where the radical republic implemented a lot of change. In this case, we have the 1795 constitution I had mentioned before, which indicated that law was a matter of circumstance rather than simple equality. There's this change from the radical republic. Sharma says that there was a dependence on organized killing to accomplish political ends in the radical republic, and similarly Danton says that executions were necessary to appease the people. But then when we move on to the conservative republic, after the Thermidorian reaction, we see that the sans-culottes were once more disarmed and disenfranchised. The journée that the sans-culottes had used effectively in the storming of the Tuileries and so on were now met by a whiff of grape shot, as Napoleon puts it. Their power on the streets was no longer possible, and thus the workers, again, were restricted to a minor voting role, disarmed and disenchanted. The rich were again favoured by the 1795 constitution. The women returned to political irrelevance. The nobility and the clergy returned to some semblance of power so long as they were not an emigre and supported the new revolutionary government. The Republican government did implement some changes. They did maintain the abolition of privilege. However, to a large extent, there was still a lot of continuity compared to 1791. For context, it's important to note that this switching back to conservatism was largely caused because the war began to turn in France's favour by this time. And so radicalism was losing its popularity. There was no longer a need for radicalism because France began to win. And of course, the memories of the terror, Robespierre and the mass murder that had occurred in Paris encouraged a return to old conservatism. If we look at the quote at the bottom, we can see that the rich rentier, the rich tenant farmer, and the former nobility were the people who held voting power by 1795, not the people, as had been the case in the Radical Republic. That is a change. So, if we are to evaluate the revolution in its entirety, if we take the changes by 1795, the Thermidorian reaction under the Directory, we can see that there was change in the fact that the government was now a republic and not a monarchy, though it would not last this long until Napoleon comes in. Voting power was granted to the rich rather than the noble, which was a change to an extent. The clergy and nobility were massively disempowered compared to the absolute monarchy, though of course many of them were still wealthy and still managed a decent amount of political clout. And of course, aristocratic privilege was destroyed in its entirety as the monarchy itself had fallen. However, it is important to note here that there was some continuity as well by 1795. Workers and women had always been politically irrelevant, and by 1795 that had not changed. In fact, they were even weaker than in the 1791 constitution, as voting privileges were even more preferential to the rich rather than to the common man. Workers, women, and peasants included were thus disarmed and their voting power drastically reduced. In the end, the rich still remained the most powerful in the government, and the government was built upon conservatism, not progress. The Radical Republic had promised progress and this kind of utopia for the people, but this was no longer the case. The government was now conservative, similar to as it had been in 1791. So if we look at this quote from Doyle, the effect of the revolution was to accelerate or retard certain trends, not to change their general drift. This is an indication of continuity. There was not a significant change that turned everything on its head. It was more that things that were already bound to happen were simply accelerated or slowed down. So, for my final tip, we'll take a look at some of the more practical concerns of the history exam. So extended responses and 10-mark source analyses will often require you to consider continuity or change in relation to an event. This is what this entire presentation is trying to get you to understand. Students, I've noticed, often forget about the conservative republic phase after the Thermidorian reaction. And it is true that it is a very minor part of the revolution, but should always be included somewhere, as this is where most of the continuity of the situation is prevalent, as this is where most of the reforms of the radical republic are reversed, are put back on, and instead a return to the provision of 1791 occurs. In general, dates only need to be remembered to the month unless it's a very packed month and a lot of events occur. And of course, in the end, historical perspectives and historical interpretations, you should not try to fill your brain with as many as you possibly can. Rather, focusing on a few more versatile ones that are very easy to remember and can apply to nearly every topic is vastly preferred, as this will free up a lot of space for analysis, which is a very important part of the extended responses and source analyses. And with that, I believe we are done.